to Hot Boys Garage, episode 24.
This is the third video in our 4-part series that is all about a 2006 Honda TRX450R engine with a new build combination. In this video, we're going to cover how to set and check your piston ring end gaps. This will be specific to the 2006 Honda TRX450R engine, but it'll still be applicable to many other engine types too. Alright, so let's jump right into it. The next step in the process is checking and setting your piston rings end gap. And for that, you'll need your piston, your rings, your complete ring pack. You'll also need your cylinder, some feeler gauges, a piston ring filer, a service manual if you're doing a stock rebuild, or if you've got an aftermarket piston, it should come with a spec sheet. And then something optional you can have is a piston ring squaring tool. This is just used to square the rings once you've put it in the cylinder, like so. If you don't have one of these, they're pretty cheap on Amazon. You can actually just flip your piston over, like so, and use that to square the rings up in the bore. So let's jump into it. So the top 1 or 2 rings of your piston, depending on its design, are the compression rings. And their job is to keep compression inside of the combustion chamber. And they're made out of a much harder material, and usually the top ring will actually be made out of even harder material than the second ring because they see a lot of heat. The gap that we put in these is to account for thermal expansion. As the engine runs and there's combustion that happens in the combustion chamber, things heat up. And as things heat up, the piston grows, which squeezes these rings together, and if you don't have your ring end gap set properly, i.e. not enough gap, the ring ends can end up buttoned together like this. And when that happens, there's no place else for them to go except for out or up. So usually what will happen is you'll get damage to your cylinder, or the rings will try and lift out of the ring lands of the piston, and a catastrophic engine failure could occur. But if you've got these two loose and the gap is huge like this, then that's going to let a lot of combustion out of the combustion chamber, and you'll end up experiencing a lot of blow-by and overall lack of power. And then you've got your oil rings, which are further down on the piston. They're a little bit flimsier material, not quite as stiff, and their job is just to control oil. That is to not allow oil to get into the combustion chamber. And then in between those two oil rings is this little guy, which is your oil expander ring. Its only real job is to sit between the two oil rings and keep them away from each other, because all three of those, the two small oil rings and the little squiggly oil expander, ride in the same groove in this same land down here at the bottom of the piston. All that said, it begs the question, what should your piston ring end gap be? Well, the bottom line is it varies. It's going to vary on the piston manufacturer and material, and it's going to vary on your application. So on the board here on the left, I've got what CP Pistons recommends. You can see at the top, I've got the various top ring recommendations for street, drag race, and power adder, and those respectively are your bore measurement times 4.5 thousandths of an inch, bore times 5 thousandths of an inch, and then bore times 5.5 thousandths for power adders. And again, that's for your top compression ring. They like to set the second compression ring at 4 to 8 thousandths larger than the top ring, and they recommend your oil rings be 15 thousandths of an inch gap minimum. And then over on the right, I've got the OEM specs directly from the service manual for the 2006 up TRX450R and the first generation TRX450R. And I've got the ring end gaps there for the top, second, and oil rings. I showed you what CP recommends and what the OEM service manual says, but on the left is the rule of thumb that I like to use personally. And I break it down really between two categories of engines, ones that run with coolant and ones that run without coolant, aka dry block. So for the top compression ring for an engine with coolant, I do bore times 4 to 4.5 thousandths, and for a dry block I do bore times anywhere from 5 to 7 thousandths. And 7 thousandths seems like a lot, but for an engine that runs with no coolant, I tend to err on the side of caution, especially some of the street builds. If you've got a pavement racer that's running without coolant, those engines can get pretty hot, both warming up and then warming up the tires, and then like a full 1/8 mile pass. That's a pretty long time for an engine without any coolant to be running, and that combustion chamber can get pretty hot. And then if there's a second compression ring, I tend to like to see at least 2 thousandths larger of a gap than the top ring, and that larger gap on the second compression ring is because if any of the combustion gases get past the first ring, you want that second ring to have a larger gap so that that combustion gas can get all the way through and go down into the crankcase, because you don't want that combustion gas to be trapped in between the top and second compression ring, because that will cause ring flutter. And then lastly, for the oil rings, I tend to go with the rule of thumb of 15 thousandths of an inch or more gap on those. So over on the right hand side, I've got a practical application of this, and this is for a 99 millimeter piston and cylinder. 99 millimeters is 3.8976 inches. So for an engine with coolant, that 3.8976 times the 4 to 4.5 thousandths gives me a target top ring gap of 15.5 thousandths to 17.5 thousandths. And then on that same size piston, if it's going to be a dry block engine with no coolant, I'm going to shoot for 19.5 thousandths all the way up to 27 thousandths for my top ring gap. And again, the longer that that engine runs, the more cylinder pressure and load that that engine sees, I'll tend to go with a larger gap over a smaller gap every time. Then if the piston's got a second compression ring, I'll go anywhere from 2 to 6 thousandths larger than a top ring. And then for the oil rings, I'll shoot for between 15 and 25 thousandths. So again, that's just what I use. Your mileage may vary. I'd recommend two things if you're unsure. Number one, consult the manufacturer or your builder, or err on the side of caution and use a little bit larger ring gap than one that's too tight. Okay, one more thing before we get started measuring and filing the rings is that the top and bottom of the rings matter, especially the compression rings. Usually some ring packs, the compression rings will have like a symbol, letter, or a dot on one side of them, and that will be the side that faces up. Some ring packs like this one don't have a dot or any letters on them. They'll let you easily see what's up and what's down. So for those compression rings, you have to look a little bit closer. I don't know if it's going to show up on camera, but you have to look at the inside of the ring. Bottom of the inside of the ring will be completely squared off, and this is the bottom. Again, I'm not sure if this is going to show up on camera. This is the bottom. And if I flip it over and we look at this side, I don't know if you're going to be able to tell, but the inside of this ring has a little inward bevel to it. And that side that's got the inward bevel on the inside of the ring, it's going to be the top. So for rings like these where I don't have like a really easy visual indicator, we'll take a Sharpie and put some marks on the top of this ring so I can easily see which side is the top. This also comes in handy for a good visual indicator for which side of the ring you're going to file, because you only want to file on and remove material from one side of the ring. You want to leave one side perfectly square and untouched. That way you've got a reference for how square your ring filing is. And I'll go over that a little bit more in a minute. All right, so first thing, you'll take your cylinder, and I like to start with my compression ring, and I'll usually put like a small coat of oil either on the ring or the cylinder to help the ring go in. We'll squeeze the ring together a little bit, insert it like this, flip it over, and bring it up to where it is, you know, about an inch or maybe a little less in the bore. And then you'll use your piston or your piston ring squaring tool and square the ring up in the bore. And what's nice about these little piston ring squaring tools is these little bushings on here are exactly an inch. So you know you've got the piston ring an inch down in the bore each time you measure. So this will be our initial measurement. You can see in there, this will show up on camera, this ring unfiled does have a little gap. So we can measure it with a feeler gauge. But if you stick a ring in here and it has no gap, you'll have to remove a small amount of material to get your initial measurement. Next, you'll take your feeler gauges, you'll start slipping them into the gap to see how large of a feeler gauge you can fit between that gap. Now with this, you don't want to force the feeler gauge in there. You want a feeler gauge that's going to go with a little bit of pressure, but not to where you have to push it down in there hard with your finger. And obviously if you've got a feeler gauge that'll slip in there and you can wiggle it around, it's super easy to go in. You're going to want to go to the next size feeler gauge up and try that. So for this ring, my initial measurement, I've got a 9 thousandths gap. So for this top compression ring for a 99 millimeter piston in an engine that's going to be used with coolant, my target is between 15.5 and 17.5 thousandths ring end gap. Current gap that I just measured is 9 thousandths of an inch. So that means I want to remove 7 thousandths of an inch of material off of one side of the ring to get me in my target ring gap. Now you can pull your ring out of the cylinder, bring it over to your ring filer, lay it on here, and again, you're going to want to remove material from one side of the ring only. And this is a small little manual hand crank filer with a diamond wheel. I've seen people set up rings to where they do it on this side of the little button, where they do it on this side of the little button, but there's two important things to note with this. One, you want this face of the ring to be perfectly square with the wheel, and I don't think this is showing up on camera very well, so I grabbed the flashlight. What you don't want is for the face of the ring to be angled on this wheel like this, or the other way like this. You want that face of the ring to be perfectly flat against that diamond wheel. And the other thing is while you're filing, you want to make sure the ring is supported. So squeeze it up against the stopper this way, or from the other side this way, and support it and hold it perfectly flat to the wheel as you crank and remove material. I'd recommend going really slow. These diamond wheels, they'll remove material fairly quickly. File a little bit, pull the ring off, and butt it up to make sure that you're perfectly square to the untouched side of the ring. Put it back in the cylinder and measure it again just like we did the first time with the feeler gauge. Now, something that might not be in the budget for everyone, but if you do a lot of rebuilds, something like this power ring filer from Total Seal is awesome. Now, they are relatively expensive, but I gotta say these things are pretty sweet. With this, you put your ring up here, you drop down this little doohickey here, which actually lets you square up the face of the ring before you even start cutting. And then once you've got it square to that, lift it up and you flip it on and you can start cutting. And you've got really fine control over how much material you remove from the ring, and you can see that via the dial indicator over here. So as I screw this knob in, you can see that's how much material it's going to remove from the ring. It really makes quick and easy work for doing ring end gaps like this. But even with this thing, I go slow on removing material. I won't take it all in one cut. I'll kind of sneak up on it, and just like you would with a manual ring filer, I'll take it in and out of this thing as many times as I need to, put it back in the cylinder, and check my gap. Once you've got your ring filed and your ring end gap set correctly, we're still not quite done yet. If you run your fingers over the side that you filed, you can probably feel a slight catch. These are burrs on the end of the ring. And you can't put it in like this. So a lot of people will use like a small jeweler's file. And I've got this little thing here. I'm not real sure what it's made out of, but I've always used it on piston rings. But I'll take and I'll knock those burrs off with this. And you don't want to get carried away with this. You really don't want to try and remove material with it. You use the file and you'll remove the burrs from the top and bottom, inside and outside. And you want to work on that until you can run your finger over this ring and not feel any burrs or feel your finger catch on anything. And then once you've done that, take and slip the ring into its ringland on the piston. And make sure you can rotate that ring around inside the ringland, and it should rotate smoothly. I kind of side load it to the top and on the bottom, rotate it just to make sure you don't feel anything catching. And if you feel anything catch, you've probably still got a burr on that ring. Make sure you find it, file it off. Next, you'll do your oil rings the same way. Slip them in, square them up, take your measurement with your feeler gauge, and adjust the ring gap if necessary. Now, a lot of people don't check the oil rings at all. I always do. And again, I like to see at least a 15 thousandths gap. One note of caution with the oil rings, they are really flimsy, so you have to take your time with the feeler gauge, make sure you get a good clearance measurement in there. And if you do file them, they are not nearly as hard as the compression rings. So you can remove material from the oil rings very, very quickly. So go slow, don't remove too much material. Keep this flat face of the ring flat. And again, go slow so you don't have to buy a new ring pack. One last note, make sure you clean your piston rings after you filed them, because as you can see here on the ring filer, it generates little particles of dust, and you really don't want that going into your new top end. So clean them and wipe them down before you install them on the piston.
That's it for this episode.
Make sure you check out the other episodes in this video series. Episode 1 covers your rough initial measurements and cylinder fitment check. Episode 2 covers how to measure your piston to cylinder wall clearance. And then episode 4 is going to cover some miscellaneous things, such as piston to oil squirter clearance, ring clocking, and more. You can check out the video description for direct links to all the episodes.
No, all the episodes. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Thanks for watching.